We good?
We are running.
Okay. Gentlemen, ladies.
It's a holiday in Canada, so our friends will be here.
Okay.
It's Epiphany's a
When you get
holiday.
older, you don't have that junction.
I get to start boring you
That's where you're
now.
wrong. All the retired people are
I
here.
don't have the time, I know.
Sister.
Oh, you're not retired yet, right? We need a balance. So you're not old enough, that's the
Yeah,
problem.
I know.
whatever happened to Dr. Bell?
Okay.
Yeah,
I
I,
bought him a bell from California.
Oh, is that what it's gonna be?
Maybe
I have to interrupt you for a 50-minute commercial.
Okay.
Okay, does anybody have any questions? I think the last topic we were dealing with was situation ethics. And in a very real sense, one of the major problems with situation ethics is that they're very good on the situation, but I was going to say they omit the ethics. They omit the act itself. And that's the reason why on page 21, section 12B, we take up the 3 determinants of the morality of an act. And you see we have what I'm more used to calling the object, the end, and the circumstance. The end of the agent is what is commonly just called the end, the motive, the purpose for which the act is performed. The end of the act is also called the object. It is the nature of the act itself. Now, the nature of the act allows us to classify acts as acts of murder, revenge, incest, thievery, embezzlement, and so forth. It's the nature of what you're doing. And that is the determinant that situationism has a problem with, because ultimately they don't count it. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we proceed. Circumstances, obvious. You're talking about the the time, the place, the relationship, the who's doing what to whom, and so forth, all of which condition the morality of the act. But the simple fact is that what we call situationism takes into account the first and the third. It takes into account the end of the agent, and it takes into account the circumstances. But what it denies is the end of the act, or the object of the act, that the act itself has some kind of intrinsic morality to it. And they have to do that because the problem is this. If you have an intrinsically bad act, how do you make it good? Situationism, which is simply a variant of utilitarianism, tells us that the end ultimately justifies the means. And as such, any means may be justified. The difference between any form of utilitarianism or situationism on the one hand and natural law ethics on the other, simply put, is that to the situationist or utilitarian, a good end can justify any means. To traditional natural law ethicians, an end, no matter how good it may be, can never justify an intrinsically evil means. So that when we talk about the end does not justify the means, what we mean to say is that a good end cannot justify an evil means. And if you once allow that it can, you really have no ethics left. But let's probe a little more deeply into the circumstances. Bearing in mind that when the situationist talks about the situation, he's putting together 2 things. He's putting together the circumstances and the motive of the agent. All those things constitute what he would call the situation. What's at issue, though, is does the act itself have a certain nature? And is it possible that it be, if it is a bad nature, what then can you do with it? The situationist has to ultimately deny that acts have intrinsic morality. And that's why, as I was saying in the last class, in terms of their epistemology, they've got to say that you cannot know the nature of the act. The act doesn't have an intelligibility in itself. Murder is not something that is such that you can understand it and understand it as always being wrong. Remember, they would say, that the traditional ethician would say that murder is always wrong, but then they turn around and say, well, but you can have self-defense, or you can have a just war. So these are instances of killing, be careful there, the word killing. They're instances of killing, but they're justified by traditional natural law, and that's why the situationist accuses the natural law ethician of being a phony, because he says these are universals, but then he has exceptions. Now, of course, the answer to that, before we let it escape ourselves, is that these are not exceptions, but simply they don't fulfill the definition of the act itself. For example, murder, properly defined, is the unjust, I can't remember what it is, the unauthorized and deliberate taking of an innocent human life. So, in the case of self-defense, now the only person that can authorize deliberately taking an innocent human life is God himself, because he makes it. But you're not deliberately taking an innocent human life in the case of self-defense, or presumably in the case of a just war, because the life that you're taking is not innocent. By definition, it's guilty. It's an aggressor, or someone who's committed a grievous crime worthy of capital punishment. See, but that gets more complex. You have to explain all those details. It's much easier for the situationist to just say, you made an exception and there's really no basis for it. So that's why we have to look more closely at what we mean by the object, the end, and the circumstance. Circumstances which include the end of the agent, and I'm back looking at our notes again, are to the act, and by the act we mean the object itself, as accidents are to a substance. In other words, the substance of the act is, what is it I am doing when I perform this act? Not why I do it. I may be taking a life. And I may have a wonderful reason for doing it, like I want this person's inheritance. But the difficulty is, if the person is innocent, I have no right to do that. And by its very nature, it is what we call murder. That's the substance of the act. And all the accidents in the world, which may make it better, are not going to make it legitimate if it's a bad act. That's what it simply comes down to. I always remember opening a can of minced meat when I was a kid and finding it full of worms. For some reason, I never wanted to eat minced meat again, to this day. And the difficulty is, you could imagine that, from the outside of the package, it looked fine. It looked perfect. You could have painted it up. You could have set off fireworks around and said how wonderful it was. The problem is, I couldn't eat it. And I don't think anybody else could either. The substance, the stuff itself, the minced meat itself was no good, to put it mildly. And that's the difficulty with respect to the accidents. They surround the act. You can make all kinds of stories up to affect why it should be justifiable to do this or that, or the circumstances are just terrible to follow the law and so forth. But the difficulty is, if the act itself is intrinsically immoral, you can't make it good. It's bad by its nature, just like the mincemeat was wormy. There's no way, start picking off the worms. Are you going to eat it? I don't think so. And we have the same difficulty here. People get so focused on the circumstances that they forget the nature of what is going on. Natural law is more difficult for people to grasp many times because you have to think through what is the nature of the act. And can you classify acts in certain ways that would allow you to know that they're good or bad? And the difficulty is the act itself may be good, but the circumstances can make it wrong, right? In other words, you may have a perfectly good act like picking up a $100 bill and putting it in your pocket. But if it happens that somebody else dropped it and you see them standing there, you can't do that. It sure sounds good. The accidents of the act perfect the act. Notice, they perfect the act itself. But that's why you can't make an evil act good, because if the act is evil, what are you going to perfect? In fact, our Lord said it very clearly for all to hear back in the Gospels. You can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Isn't that what it comes down to? And so look at the examples here with respect to the sexual act. The end of the agent, that is the motive for placing the act, can be pleasure of intercourse itself. It can be the desire for a child. It could be monetary in the case of prostitution. It could be to save one's life if one were ordered to do it at the point of a gun. Those are all the motivations of the person placing the act. But if you consider the act of intercourse itself, its whole intelligibility is that it has to do with producing a new child. The whole meaning of sex, I mean, I know we've gotten so confused about it in today's society that people lose sight of what it's all about. But we know only too well what it's about, otherwise Planned Parenthood wouldn't be going crazy trying to stop its results. Everybody knows full well it's about producing more human beings. That's the essence of the act. That's the nature of the act. It doesn't matter what the purpose that one may have for placing the act. That's not going to change the nature of the act. The act is directed to new life. You know, sometimes people get into discussions about things and they get beyond the obvious and start arguing about details that don't really matter. I've often thought in the case of the arguments about homosexuality, about same-sex marriage, that if for one moment you take seriously the possibility that there could be such a thing, you've already lost the argument. It's unintelligible in itself. I mean, people know this as a gut reaction. That's why it's like taking the minced meat and trying to make it look good on the outside. You're going to pile all kinds of things on it to cover up the worms, but it doesn't get rid of them. If same-sex marriage is a non-entity, if it just doesn't exist, and if one momentary reflection on the nature of the two sexes tells you that that's not what marital union is about, all the rest of your arguments about happiness and security and legality, that's just the stuff on the outside. It's not going to make it real. It's not going to create of this union the nature of marriage. But we'll talk about that when we deal with that in itself. Finally, the circumstances, literally from the Latin, circum meaning around and stare meaning to stand. It's what stands around the nature of the act. And once again, though, what stands around the act isn't the act. Accidents, accidere, fall onto the substance. Substance is what stands under. Sub stare, under, to stand under. The substance stands under the accidents. The circumstances are the accident of the act, accidents. But the substance is what it is that we are doing. It's the nature of the act itself. And that's why really there's only one thing that matters. Do acts have natures? The situationist has to say they don't, ultimately. And that's why it's connected to a metaphysics and an epistemology and a cosmology which have certain values that are different than those of traditional natural law ethics. That's why in terms of the metaphysics of the situationist, he has to be a nominalist. He has to deny that things have natures. Because only if you deny that they have natures can you get away from judging the nature of the act. Every act to the situationist is not defined by its intrinsic nature, but its relation to all other things. And that's why Dr. Fletcher would be so insistent that what really matters is that we do the loving thing. So notice we've subjectivized the act. We're going to do the loving thing. It's not a question of what the thing is, it's a question of how we love when we do it. And how do we determine the loving thing? Well, that's measured not by what we do, but the results of what we do. So we're standing all on the outside of what's going on. We're looking at our subjectivity as to why we do it, and we're looking at the results that will be produced. And the one thing we don't want to look at is what we're doing. Is it the destruction of an innocent, unborn human life? And we don't want to get into that. Let's go over to page 22. Further distinctions concerning the act itself. Notice that the term moral, most of this is self-evident material here. I'm almost just reading it to you. The term moral is not to be confused with morally good. Yeah. An act may be moral in the sense that it is an act of morality, but it may be bad morality. It may be morally evil or morally good. It's a moral act. Most people, when they talk about being moral, they mean morally good, but they don't say it. The term moral just refers to the order of morality, those acts over which we have free and deliberate control and choice, which are ordered or disordered in relation to our last end. That's what morality is. But the only acts that are morally good are the ones that are ordered to our last end. Moreover, the physical act is not identical to the moral act. For example, when you amputate a gangrenous leg, the physical act is you're sawing through somebody's leg, right? But what's the morality of the act? If you're just running around sawing off people's legs, it's probably not very good. If, in fact, you are removing a gangrenous threat to the life of the person, then it's a good act. But you see how easy it is to get confused there between the purpose and the nature of the act itself. Remember when we, way back, were doing double effect? This is why you can go through this and you still come back and you look at it again and say, what are we doing here? And we have to bear in mind that the nature of the act, in the case of removing, what is it that you're doing when you're removing the leg? Well, if you're removing legs, that's not very good, is it? No, what you're doing is you're removing a threat to somebody's life. That's what you're doing. But you can't tell that just by the physical act of sawing. That's going to happen whether you're saving the person's life or you're simply doing bad things to them. Another example of that, to take is not identical with to steal. We take things all the time. I take this paper up. That's not stealing. I take a pen that you hand to me. That's not stealing. But if I wait till you're looking the other way and I grab your wallet, that's thinking. That's talking about a Freudian slip. That's stealing. That's stealing. To kill is not identical with to murder, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, because it could be an act of self-defense either of the individual or of the country. To take a life, and this is a beautiful example, because look at the alternatives here. The physical life act of taking a life can be, in terms of the classification of acts, the nature of the act, it can be an act of abortion, it can be an act of capital punishment, it can be an act of self-defense, it can be an act of justifiable homicide, it could be negligent homicide, it could be a pure accident. And these are all different moral classifications of natures of act depending upon how you define what you're doing. But the act itself still is killing. So that's why we distinguish between the matter of the act and the form of the act. The matter is what you're doing. The form is what is the nature of what it is you're doing. Because when we say what you're doing, I'm referring to the physical act. The formal act requires some understanding. I mean, the act of running somebody down with a car. To understand the nature of the act, you have to understand not simply the fact that the person's being smashed with a 2-ton vehicle, but also what is the person driving the car intending to do. Now be careful, because that tells you the motive, doesn't it? Tells you his purpose. But it's a twofold purpose. He's killing this person, presumably for some further reason or motive. But the act itself, the form of the act is, I am taking the person's life with this car. But even when I say with this car, notice that's the means. That's in a sense accidental, because I could take their life with a gun. I could take it with a rope. The nature of the act is an act of murder because I am deliberately taking the person's life. The purpose, in order to steal his inheritance, that would be the end, the purpose for which I'm doing it. But the act I'm performing is an act of murder. The fact that that physically I'm driving a car and it runs a person down, that could just be an accident. So what are we doing? We're trying to understand the intelligibility of what it is the person performing the act is doing. That's in the intellectual order. It's not just the physical act. It's not just the fact that the car is knocking somebody down and killing him. And it's not just the purpose for which it's being done. It's the fact that the moral agent performing the act is understanding that he is taking away a person's life when they are innocent. That's the point. But you see, that's not a physical thing. And it isn't just the purpose for doing it. And yet it's a very real act entailing a physical activity. That's why this is complex and why people can get confused about it. But it's also why, you see, you have to have a mind that is able to penetrate beyond the sensible appearances of things in order to understand the nature of what is taking place. For Joseph Fletcher and many of the utilitarians, knowledge stops with the senses. And so you can't understand that there is an act by its very nature that's immoral going on. Because for them, all you've got is the physical act. Okay, so we're killing the person. If the purpose is good, it's okay. So see, in a way, these things look very simple and very easy, but we have to still penetrate more closely to understand what it is that we're getting at when we say that the intrinsic nature of the act is immoral. It's not just the physical act committed, and it's not just the purpose for which it's committed. It's an understanding that I am engaged at this moment in using some physical means to deprive another human being of their just right to life. That's the nature of the act. That's what I understand. And I can universalize it that every act of this type will be equally evil, equally immoral. Maybe not equally because of the circumstances, right? That can make it a little bit better or worse. But it's, again, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. There is no way to make this type of act be a good act. No matter how many lives I'm trying to save, no matter what good effects on society I'm trying to produce, if I'm engaged in the deliberate taking of an innocent human life, knowing that I'm doing it, as I'm doing it, it's an intrinsically evil act. There's no way to make it good. And that's precisely, of course, where people like Dr. Fletcher would take issue. They would say, well, of course it's all right. Of course, if the end's good enough, it's good. It's all right. If it's important enough to society, well, sometimes it just has to be that way. Again, the example of sexual intercourse as a physical act can be rape, incest, fornication, adultery, or conjugal love within the marital union. These are all different moral acts, different species of moral acts. We can understand them as different species of acts. And out of the whole bunch, the only one that's licit is the conjugal act of love between husband and wife. That's the only one that is permissible morally. How do we know that? Well, you've got to examine the whole nature and relationship of male and female and procreative acts in relation to sustaining the species. Remember the difference between what we kind of know immediately about morality, where we immediately sense that something is right or wrong, and developing a really intellectual understanding of why it's right or wrong. It's not the same. So many people have good sense about knowing that, that they would say, well, I would never sanction taking an innocent human life, but then somebody comes along and says, well, what about the case of just embryonic life before it's even implanted? The implantation hasn't even taken place. Surely that wouldn't fall under your objection to taking a human life. And you see, you can't refute that unless you go into the details of understanding when human life begins and understanding that implantation is not an essential difference. It's not whether life has begun, it's just where it is going to continue existing, having already come into being some days before. But that's why population in general can tell you that certain things seem to be wrong, but you get into all kinds of controversy at the edges on questions, especially in bioethics, where it gets difficult to discern just what's taking place. Exactly when does human life begin? That was not evident in Aristotle's time or St. Thomas's time. And that's why you had to extend the theory of successive animation. That for the first 30 days, it's just a vegetative kind of being. In the next 30 days, it's just an animal, sentient kind of being. And it wasn't until after 2 months that it was a human being. Those kind of details in today's society become fringe arguments in bioethics. They can be much more complex, and they confuse the issues to such an extent that if you're not careful and you make an exception to the rule, let's take the case of implantation. If you define human life is beginning at implantation rather than fertilization, you get a whole new set of ethics. All kinds of things suddenly become okay that would not be. For example, most types of birth control work by preventing implantation. And so suddenly those become, in the minds of those who permit contraception, those acts become okay. Whereas if life begins at fertilization, they are instances actually of homicide. So if you can confuse people, and this of course is what happened about 1966, I think it was the American College of Gynecology and Obstetrics, redefined the beginning of human life. Why? Because they knew they were handing out contraceptives right and left. And they knew what that could imply. So they weren't about to, they didn't want to leave themselves open to saying that they were committing micro-abortions. So they just redefined when human life began, and it became a whole new world to them. But since they did it, others then began to do it, and you begin to get the whole society confused about when human life begins. And that changes the whole framework of the argument about abortion. So that people will say, I'm completely against abortion, but then you say, well, you know, how about the morning after pill? Well, that's okay. You know, it's immediately after, implantation hasn't even happened yet. And that's why you'll see when they talk about RU486 or some of these morning after pills, they will actually say, they'll tell you right on TV, you know, the news tells you, it's going to be right, that these are not causing abortions, of course, but there are some people who seem to object to them because they think they do cause abortion. So what in fact is the true position now is isolated as a fringe, fanatical position only held by people for religious reasons. And hence it's just pushed off the spectrum of public dialogue as being a serious issue. That's why ethics is so difficult, especially today.
So, stealing to preserve one's own life, is that ethically acceptable? Is it no longer stealing because...
Okay. I'm glad you added that last part because I was about to jump all over your calling it stealing. In order to understand stealing, you have to understand property rights. So you have to go back to the question of private property, what its purpose is, what its justification is, and why then it becomes wrong to steal, which is where you unjustly are taking another's property. If you are starving and the person has excess food, their right to that property may terminate because it infringes upon your right to live. So it then doesn't fall under the definition of stealing.
But what if that individual produced that food through their labor while you were sitting there lazy and not being unproductive?
Well, you could make a case like that. I'm not going to argue the exact details of when it is stealing and when it's not stealing, but just realize that as you adjust the definition of stealing, you determine what the universal is. And what is important for our purposes here is to realize that there are some universals, and that you take the really obvious one of homicide, that can never be violated. If you once allow that there are such things, then you can't be a utilitarian. You can't be a situation efficient, because you've allowed that there are a class of moral acts that cannot be violated under any circumstances. That's what's at issue. That's what we mean when we say that you have moral principles. There are some things you just won't do. But of course we have to be careful because there's a distinction between what I say I won't do and what I say I shouldn't do, because oftentimes I do what I know I shouldn't do. See? People will often say, I would never do that. Well, frankly, that's one of the things I'm always afraid of saying. knowing my weak and craven human nature, I'd probably be the first to run out and do something horrible. But that doesn't make it right. What's at issue in ethics is what is right and what is wrong. And if something's intrinsically wrong, all of us putting it to a vote and saying it's right doesn't make it right. And all the circumstances in the world don't make it right. So the issue is, are there some things, by that we mean species of moral acts, which by their intrinsic nature, their very own self-definition, are always wrong? If there are, then there's no way to make them right. And if you ever allow an exception to the rule, you no longer have a rule. If it's a real rule and you make an exception to it, you don't have a rule. The situationists have no rules. And that's why I told you in the previous class about a former colleague of mine at the University of Dayton who wrote an article entitled Situation Ethics. And he said, since I am a situation ethician, what that means is I don't have any moral principles. Now, usually if you publicly say someone doesn't have any moral principles, he's going to want to sue you. But this gentleman put it in print. But he was simply, probably not with the greatest of wit, exposing what he actually held. And this, by definition, is something for which I would rule him out as a possible babysitter.
So let me rephrase my question, because I just want to make sure that there's a consistency here across the spectrum of ethics. And namely, my dilemma is this murder and stealing. So taking one's property, then, in some cases, to preserve one's own life, for instance, it's not necessarily stealing.
That's correct. That's correct. But usually these are rare cases. I mean, we can't then go around and use that as the excuse to be breaking into everybody's home. But you see, the difficulty with stealing is it's contingent upon property rights. So you have to go through the ethics of property rights and make sure you've got it all straight before you start trying to define stealing. Once again, the average person knows full well if you embezzle $15,000 from the bank, that's stealing, and it's wrong, and you can't make it right. So the marginal cases don't undo the fact that there are evident wrongs. It's like my old professor, Dr. Charles DeConnick, once said that if you're trying to tell the difference between life and non-life, you don't look at the marginal case of the virus. What you do is you look at the rock, which is obviously not alive, and you take a look at something that's fully alive, like a rabbit, and you can see that these are radically distinct. You don't make the definition in the case of the marginal case, because frequently, although the principle is clear, the application is not. And you can't determine for sure whether this thing quite fulfills the definition. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a difference between a rabbit and a rock. And again, the person who's stealing $15,000 so he can play the ponies, it's not a marginal case. But the difficulty is, with situationism, if all marginal cases determine that there are no essential cases, then anything can be justified. And eventually you could justify, presumably, stealing $15,000 to play the ponies so that you can make a lot more money to save somebody's life. You can ultimately justify everything and anything. But I concede to you that stealing is a more difficult issue because of the social philosophy involved in it. It isn't so hard when you're dealing with matters that pertain more to sexual and marital ethics and homicide. Those are clearer to deal with, much clearer, although people often are confused about them. So the physical description of an act is not identical to the moral description of the act. The physical description, sexual intercourse, obviously, is easy to define, but the moral description is very different depending upon the factors that define it. Now, you might say, something like incest, isn't it based upon the accident of relation? Because you've got two people who are biologically too closely related. And isn't that a circumstance? Well, it is a circumstance in a certain way, but it's an essential circumstance. It's one that defines the very nature of the act. The material act, then, which you notice that parallels the physical act. The material act or the physical act is not identical to the formal act or the moral description of the act. So what we're really looking at, we're trying to get at the formal act. We're trying to get at what is the nature of the act such that I can define it as belonging to one of these major categories of theft, rape, murder, treachery, you name it, calumny, detraction. I forget why I was looking at it, but I came across a list of these things, and there's like 40 different major acts that are distinct and wrong. We don't always think of them until we run into one, and then say, oh my gosh, you can't do that, so it's a terrible act. Now we have this example, one which actually I stole from Dr. Waters. I was more confessing thievery here. He gives the example of Joe raping some poor girl. The material act is rape. It results in the material act of pregnancy. Things don't go well and the poor girl dies. But the end of the act, the formal act, the whole thing was an act of revenge in which all of these other things were subordinately entailed. Oh yes, you can commit two things wrong at the same time. Joe is engaged in an act of revenge. At the same time, he's engaged in an act of rape. You can, get a twofer here. You can do two things wrong at the same time. In the act that is performed, the end of the agent, which is something good, must be intended. In other words, when I'm performing an act, the purpose for which I perform the act must be a good end. Or at least it's got to be a morally neutral end. I may be eating a hot fudge sundae because I enjoy eating a hot fudge sundae. My purpose is not nutrition. It's not good or bad in terms of my health. It may not be good for my health, but right now I'm just enjoying it. The purpose is to enjoy the pleasure of it. The end of the act, now the end of the act, when I'm eating that hot fudge sundae, like it or not, I'm going to get nutrition out of it. That's the end of the act. It's an act of nutrition. It just so happens that what I am eating, I get delight from. That's my purpose. The end of the act must be good. Now, the end of nutrition would be gaining some cellular addition, ultimately, maintaining one's metabolism. That must be intended, or at least permitted. How would I not permit the act of nutrition?
Fat blockers.
Spit it out.
Yeah, spitting it out. I'm not saying fat blockers are immoral. No, it would be to do, as you well know, the example of the Roman vomitorium, where the Romans would eat, and then for the pleasure of eating, and then they would go vomit, so they'd have room to come back and eat some more. Don't ask me how they did it. But they thought this was great fun. But that would be to denature the act of eating, because you're violating the end of the act itself. And then, of course, always remember that if evil should occur as a result of an act, at best it can only be permitted, not intended. That goes back to the principle of indirect effect or double effect. If something bad happens, it's not directly intended. Now, coming back to that hot fudge sundae, I suppose, we all know that there's probably something bad going to come of it. But it's not directly intended.
It's more like denial.
I know I'm going to wind up like one of those early American religious groups, what they call them. There's the ones that had to, you couldn't enjoy life.
Puritans?
The Puritans, yeah. You got to go around being dour all the time. If you're enjoying something, that surely proves it's evil.
It's like the movie, I don't know if you saw it, The Vet's Feast. See
Yeah, I
that?
saw it.
Where they didn't want to eat the food, they were very leery about eating the food that was being presented to them because they were the Puritans. And did you never see that?
No.
You gotta rent it.
Spectacular.
You gotta rent it.
Spectacular.
It's worth the see.
Heaven forbid we should enjoy it.
The movie?
Yeah, well, that too. Yeah, I can't see the movie if I'm a Puritan.
Right?
Now, the motive, the end of the agent, can give an indifferent act its first morality. And the act itself may be good, bad, or indifferent. If we have an indifferent act, then the question is, what makes it good or bad? Well, it depends on why I'm doing it. Walking down the street, there's nothing wrong with doing that. But if my intention is to get down to the bank, which I'm going to rob, that makes the walking immoral. There's nothing immoral about walking, but I'm not just walking. I'm walking so as to go to rob the bank. So this is why ethics is complex. And that's why we often search our own motives when we're doing something, because we're trying to figure out, what is it I'm really doing? Why am I really doing this? What is the nature of the act I'm performing? Is it licit? Again, most people have a fair sense of what is right or wrong in general terms. And that's why sometimes people say, well, you don't need to study ethics. We all know what's right or wrong. The difficulty is that we don't on the margins. We don't in the difficult cases. And that's why we need principles to determine them. And that's why, of course, in this hospital setting, especially today, it's the bioethical questions that require the application of natural law ethical principles. Unfortunately, most of the ethics committees in hospitals are inhabited by not ethicians, but ethicists who are utilitarians. So you're really just asking their opinion of whether they think there's a good enough reason for doing something. If they find there's a good enough reason, they'll do it, or they'll sanction doing it. But this may lead them to allow a human being to do something that's unethical, whereas they might object to doing something to an animal. For example, they might allow euthanasia to a human being because it's painless, but very much object to cruelty to animals that entails torture because it's painful, not distinguishing between the rights of animals and the rights of humans, wherein the animals don't have any rights. No such thing as animal rights, if you understand what a right is. Human beings have rights, and you possess the right to life, whether I take it away from you with torture or whether I do it very benignly. I'm still committing a homicide. We don't torture animals not because they have rights not to be tortured, but because it is an irrational act for us to act in that way in relation to them. To will the act is, or ought to be, to will the purpose of the act. In other words, if I'm going to perform an act, whatever my reason for performing it, I ought to at the same time be willing that the act be what it is. And so to eat, if I'm eating, whatever reason I'm eating for, maybe I just love the food, or maybe I'm in a pancake eating contest, or some people get into worm eating contests. I heard of somebody here a number of years ago who won the worm eating contest, and a couple weeks later he died.
Ew.
But anyway, if you're eating, the end of the act is nutrition. It doesn't matter why you're eating. The end of the act is nutrition. So you ought to be open to the end of the act. You ought not be trying to defeat the nutritive end of the act. I know, you're going to bring up those fat blockers again, aren't you?
Even with the Sunday, if you go out for the pleasure of a Sunday, and you still have to have that end.
Well, the point is, you can't directly act against the nutritive act itself
Okay, so.
by vomiting.
So who are these people? What is that disease that people have that they?
Anorexia.
Anorexia?
Anorexia.
The anorexics throw up
Yeah,
their food.
but they're not Roman, so it's okay.
So it's up.
No, they're ill, okay, just for
Oh.
purposes of the recording here.
So,
See, you have
so
a-
they are acting against the end, right?
But they're not, because it's not within their power to control what they're doing. That's why you've got to take into account all the subjective elements of the act as well.
Just the Romans.
So
So when in Rome.
don't do as the Romans do. The point is that we at least ought not to will actively the contrary of the end of the act as we're placing the act. Why not? Ultimately, because we would be contradicting our very act. The act itself that we're placing, we are contradicting as we place it. Now, man is a rational animal. Rationality means we don't live in contradiction. So we ought not place acts that contradict the very essence of the act we're placing. That's the nature of what we're talking about here. Nature determines what is more normal. Frequency determines what is common. Unfortunately today, of course, you see all these polls of what do people do? If you want to know, is it normal to do this or that? There's always polls that will say, 90% of the people get drunk Friday night. Well, then it must be normal. Well, no, it's not normal, it's frequent. It's common, owing to the weakness of human nature. What is normal is that which is appropriate to human nature. What is done in accord with human nature. What is done in accord with a proper understanding of human nature adequately considered. That's what's normal, Joe.
Synonymous with natural, normal and natural.
Yes, that's right. Normal would be synonymous with what is natural. But today, people often confuse it with frequency. And of course, since the vast majority of mankind frequently do horrible things that they really shouldn't do, that's not a very good standard. Here we have some examples of situation ethics in education. I don't know quite, well, obviously we dealt with situationism before, and we've just been making some distinctions about the nature of the act. But on page, is that page? Yeah, page 23. Page 23G. Situation education is found in such courses or sub-courses. It may be found, doesn't have to be, but it frequently is. Things such as values clarification, parenting courses, effective parenting, information for children, sex education, family life education. Unfortunately, in secular hands, and mind you, and if you're dealing with somebody whose mentality is secular, whether they are in a public or non-public school, they automatically fall into the context of situationism in their so-called ethics. The problem with situationism is it's not ethics. It's a methodology for justifying whatever you really want to do, or whatever you really feel needs to be done. And people have done that forever, but that's not ethics. The example of values clarification overwhelms a student with a complex case of examples full of circumstances, and somebody in a previous class had mentioned this. This is the famous lifeboat case, where they take students and tell them you've left in a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean and you've got enough room on the boat for 8 people and you've got 10 people trying to get in the boat. Well, who do you throw out? And then they give the poor students all kinds of examples. You know, somebody's got a terminal illness, somebody's 95, somebody has an IQ of 13, and so forth. And then they ask them which one ought to be thrown out. And all they're doing is focusing the children on these circumstances and getting them to determine what would be the best result in the long run, paying no attention to the fact that the answer is you can't throw anybody out, that you cannot willingly deprive the right to life of anybody. If somebody wants to jump overboard, that's their prerogative, but you have not the right to throw them out. And evil means does not justify a good end. Again,
What about, I'm just, I have the Titanic in my mind. What about taking on added passengers? You have a full boat, 10. 2 more are in the water and they're begging to get on that boat.
is it going to sink the boat?
Probably.
Well, you're not throwing them out.
You're just allowing.
You got to distinguish between what you will and what you permit.
Okay.
I mean, it's very sad, but it's not like they're sitting there and you throw them out.
What's
the
the
moral is
difference?
get on it.
You can, the difficulty is you can always find circumstances which seem to belie the principle at hand. If the person is sitting there and you physically throw them out against their will, it's not the same thing as just saying, I'm sorry, I can't help you. In one case, you're physically actively doing something whereby you throw them into their death. In the other case, you're permitting that they die, yes, but you surely don't will it. And you're not obligated to kill yourself in order to save them.
You would help them if you could.
You would, yeah, you definitely would help them if you could, but you can't, because if you help them, you're killing the other 7 who are already there. Life, does not guarantee that you're always going to get easy choices, and that's why, what are you supposed to do? Bring a copy of Higgins with you in the lifeboat? Just a minute, I got to look this up. It isn't always possible. And that's why we have rules of thumb, remember? Like a doubtful obligation doesn't bind. Are you in
What if they're
doubt?
trying to get onto the boat and you prevent them from coming on?
Well, you actually could get into a circumstance of self-defense, I'm afraid. Oh, bear in mind, I have to warn you, I'm teaching a course in ethics here. I'm trying to give you the general principles. Do not walk out of here and assume that because I said something on these marginal cases that's infallible. No, I can be wrong. I can be wrong. I just want you to know the general principles and something about how you have to try to apply them. Don't say I killed him because Dr. Bonnette said I could.
Keep away from Edward's boat, that's all.
Once again, though, notice the terms here. Empiricism, the idea that all you know is what you know through the senses, leads to nominalism, which says that there aren't any universals, it's just names for universals. And that, of course, is the heart and soul of situationism. So that when you say it's wrong to kill people, well, you don't really mean that. You just mean it's kind of a term that applies to many cases, but there's exceptions to all the cases. So I don't think Dr. Fletcher would want to say, well, I couldn't trust him. But you see, the problem is logically, I can't trust him. He's told me how he operates in his ethics, and he's told me I really can't trust him. As ultimately, he may have to do something that would seem to be contrary to a moral principle. Sensism, which goes along with empiricism, tells us there is no intellectual knowledge of the nature of anything. If you can't know the nature of things, then you can't know what is natural or normal. That's the point. So, understandably, if you once key yourself into accepting that you can know what is natural or normal, you're going to be bound by the judgments that flow from that. And that's why the ethics is correlated with the metaphysics and the epistemology and the philosophical psychology. And that's why the situationist would tend to view man as simply a highly developed animal who would tend to interpret evolution in such a way that there is no stable human nature, and who would follow an epistemology that would say there's no way to know such a stable nature because it doesn't exist. Those correlative philosophical sciences and the positions held in them fit along with situationism. Natural law ethics, conversely, has a metaphysics that says there is a fundament in the thing itself, which is the basis for the nature, which I can know by my intellect in the order of epistemology, which allows me to have universal understandings in the order of my psychology. So these all fit together. You're going to line up either on one side of this set of equations or the other side of it. It isn't, so you can't just say, well, I'm going to be, in my metaphysics, I'm a dualist, I'm a Thomist, but in my ethics, I'm a situationist. They don't go together. And conversely, I can't say that I endorse natural law in my ethics, but in my metaphysics, I don't think there's such a thing as nature, and if there is, I can't know it. See? Then I've ripped out the foundation for my natural law ethics. This, again, though, shows you why it is difficult in the public forum or when you're talking to somebody rapidly or in a short length of time to explain fully the reason why you hold the position you do. There's a lot to it. And that's why there's a difference between what everybody intuitively knows about what's right and wrong on the one hand, and on the other hand, a formal course in ethics. And the problem, of course, remember, even if you finish a formal course in ethics, number one, you're going to run into hard cases that are hard to figure out. And number two, you're going to run into situations that arise so rapidly you don't have time to think them out, even if you know the principles. Well, that's enough for one night. Thank you.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com.